Hello, everybody. So as we start to move into the second episodes, we talked last time, you should have seen an episode about social constructionism. I told you I was going to confuse you, in part because the next section is called social constructivism. Constructivism. The difference is in perspective. So part of thinking about perspectives of education has a whole lot to do with thinking about how we build that knowledge. So rather than thinking about pouring information in, we're thinking about structuring it. What we're going to do is I want to talk about some of the components. So the components are built from Vygotsky, and Vygotsky talked about three really major components with teaching constructionism. The first one has to do with the zone of proximal development. The second has to do with the concept of scaffolding. The third has to do with a more knowledgeable other. They all interweave together to demonstrate how somebody else can guide us through that learning process. It's really it's using Bloom's taxonomy, which will be the next session, but it's using Bloom's taxonomy in a way that's really proactive and constructed throughout our process. The zone of proximal development is where I want to start, and I've always found the easiest way to start that construct and start that understanding is really through a story. So let me tell you a story about my son. The first thing you need to know about this story, that's the most important part, is I like M&Ms. I like M&Ms at night. I like to get a little dish and eat my M&Ms, especially peanut M&Ms. They're the best M&Ms, followed very closely by peanut butter, but that's a different story. And by the way, if you eat Skittles, it's not that you're a bad person, you just have issues and should probably consider therapy. But that said, the problem with when I had my M&Ms is these little dishes fill up too quick, so I get myself a very large bag of M&Ms. No, I'm not getting any commercial proceeds from this either. But when I got my big M&Ms, I'd fill my dish, my 16-year-old son, who also likes M&Ms, would find my M&Ms, steal them, and eat them all. It was quite annoying. So I'd wake up in the morning and not have any M&Ms. Well, when you run into these situations where your M&Ms are missing and you have to figure out what to do, the next bag I bought shortly thereafter, I decided I would hide my M&Ms. And so in hiding my M&Ms, I looked at what seemed to be the best place. It's low. Anthony's tall, so it's harder for him to see. He's 5'11". I am not. And it's also filled with cleaning supplies. I don't think Anthony knew he had cleaning supplies until he was 22. So it seemed like a really good place for me to hide them. So I stuck my M&Ms under the cupboard. And I waited, thinking I was so clever, how clever I was. And I woke up the next day feeling really excited about the fact that I had hid my M&Ms in a place that he could not find them. Instead of getting there the next day and seeing my M&Ms, all I saw was a sticky note that said, "I was disappointed in your attempts to hide the M&Ms. They are now gone, and you need to find them." This is why Anthony is my least favorite child. I have other children that are occasionally my least favorite, but at this point, Anthony was absolutely my least favorite child. Who would steal an old man's M&Ms? It's just wrong. And so I thought to myself, what am I going to do? I have to figure out how to make sure that I can find my M&Ms. And so what I did is I left. I tried, I looked just momentarily, and in my looking, it was so frustrating because I was never quite able to find the M&Ms. So I left that night, sad, M&M-less, unable to even think about the fact that my M&Ms were gone. About 10:30 that same night, I got the munchies and I needed my M&Ms, and I knew they were in the house because the note did not say they were gone. It just said that they were missing. And so I came back to my kitchen. And I thought to myself, where would those M&Ms be? I looked in all the obvious places, in the freezer, with the crackers, with all the chips, which makes a whole lot of sense. I looked where our canned goods are, thinking they might be there, but they weren't. There was just beans. And then I had to remember, Anthony is 5'11". And at 5'11", he thinks taller thoughts than I do. So I started looking and panning around a little bit higher. And there they were, staring me in the face. My bag of M&Ms. So I went and decided I couldn't. And I was so frustrated. I just gave up. I'm going to be honest. It just was too hard to reach it. It's 10:30 at night. I was tired. Nothing was working that day. And I went to bed M&M-less again. Sad. So I got up the next day and I was explaining to my more knowledgeable other about my dilemma with the M&Ms. And as we had a conversation, she reminded me that we are short people and we have step stools. So I was excited. So I grabbed my step stool thinking, I'm going to show him tonight. I'm going to have my M&Ms and I'm going to know exactly what to do with them. So I stood on my bag and I started to reach up. So you ever had that moment where you reach for something, right? And you reach up and you try to get it, and instead of being able to grab it, you push it further away. What I currently had was insufficient for me to be successful. My step stool didn't really make the difference I needed in the height that I had to have. So I looked at it, and I sat down, and I just kind of gave up. But my more knowledgeable other stood there next to me and handed me another thing that helped me remember what I needed to have. My books. I have a lot of books. In books, you can read them. Actually, you should read these. These are really good. They're in your list. But in addition to that, you can also use them to step on. And so I did. When you have a step stool, and you have more than one book especially, and you're standing on it, do not do this at home without supervision. I stood on it. The problem is, it's a little unstable. And so in that instability, I had to try to reach up. Now the problem is it still is a little out of reach, as you can see. And so what I had to do is not only did I have to be in an unstable place, but I had to sit on my step toes, and I'm really anxious about it. So I needed some stability. So my more knowledgeable other helped hold me as I could reach a little bit more, and I got my bag of M&Ms. When we talk about Vygotsky, when we talk about the zone of proximal development, the zone of proximal development is all about the M&Ms. Let me explain why. All right, M&Ms. Let me explain the metaphor. I know some of you are going, oh my God, I know this, but that's all right. Bear with me because I think it's worth talking about. The M&Ms of the knowledge. When we talk about Vygotsky and we talk about knowledge, that's the M&Ms, okay? So in order to get the knowledge, sometimes it's difficult to find. Sometimes it's difficult to grapple with. And when things are too simple, it's the moment where I put the M&Ms in the cabinet under the sink. It's too easy. It was not even a challenge. After a while, it gets boring. You feel, oftentimes you might experience classes as something that's beneath you, that's silly, that's redundant, that you could do on your own. If you walk into a classroom and your first instinct is to think, I could do this at home, I really don't need to be here, it's too easy. It's in that simplistic zone of the zone of proximal development. It's not helping you learn. When Anthony took my M&Ms and he put them on top of the shelf where I couldn't reach them, and I gave up so quickly, it was way outside of the zone. It was too difficult for me. And because it's too difficult, oftentimes we experience that as boredom because we don't even understand what's happening. Or we experience that teaching moment as frustrating, too difficult, just out of control. We're too stupid to do it. Anytime that you felt like you were not smart enough, anytime that you felt like you were not able to handle it, anytime that it was boring, it's probably outside of that zone of proximal development too. What I needed is I needed to use my past knowledge to reach it. Oftentimes, and this is the most dangerous part of teaching, is when you're in that spot that you are using your past knowledge and you're reaching, but you still can't touch it, you can push it out of the way if you're trying to learn it on your own without having a more knowledgeable other, someone help you to figure out what you need to know. The knowledge that you have is the books that I was given. It's that new information. But that new information, it's not yours yet. it's still unstable, hence being unstable. And it's that point that you're standing in a place that you're slightly uncomfortable with knowledge, that you can have somebody else that knows it better stabilize you, is when the knowledge becomes yours. That's the zone of proximal development. And I hope it helped you understand it. Thank you. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. As we hit midterms, we're going to move really quickly, fast and furious as we head towards the end of this semester. But while we're working on this, I wanted to do a couple of things. I want to work and give you some specific tools to help you as you think about what you're going to do within education. I also want to give you a couple of strategies. So today I'm going to do a couple of different things. The first thing I want to do is I want to teach you how to build a campfire. And I'm kind of expecting that you'll do the same thing in your own video. So this is a model that you can use to think about how you're going to do it. Now, I want to be very clear. This isn't the only way that you can do it. This isn't necessarily the right way to do it. But what I want you to think about are how you're going to put this video together that explains your lesson. So I'll start, and as I go through, I'm going to stop and give you some explanation along the way. Feel free to do the same in your own videos. There are really 4 types of ways that you can build a campfire. Now, I'm not going to get into the fireplace fire because, well, that's just a whole different deal. But today, we're going to do building a campfire. I want to begin by telling you some of the important elements of a campfire, the knowledge pieces that are essential. Campfires are used when you want to get yourself warm. They're used for cooking. They're used in opportunities to just enjoy a fire and watch the flames flicker into the sky in the middle of the night and have long, drawn-out conversations about philosophy and politics and probably social media as well. But the idea is that you're creating a place and a space for this really powerful sort of event to happen. So you've decided that you want to build a fire. There's a few things you need to know in order to build a fire. You got to have fuel. Fuel is essential. I recommend if you're going out to build a fire and you're kind of going in the woods, the first thing you should get is go into your dryer and get dryer lint. It burns great and it's a great fire starter. But you need to have fuel, so you're going to have some sort of wood or flame. You need to have a spark and you need to have oxygen. Those are the main elements for building a fire. And there's 4 types of fires that I want you to think about today. The first fire that we're going to build is called a lean-to. A lean-to is a fire that basically it's leaning up against 2 other logs. The second fire is called a star fire, and the star fire is if you sit around a fire and you want to have the logs kind of out there. The third fire that you're going to build is a teepee, and the fourth is a log cabin. Those 4 fires all have different purposes. And now you know the knowledge elements of a fire. Here's how you know they're knowledge elements. You can repeat them in the same way that you might be able to repeat multiplication tables. So play a game with me a minute, and I want you to do this out loud. And no, I don't care if people think you're weird. I want you to say out loud what 2 times 2 is. Okay?
4.
Thank you. And then I want you to say what 4 times 4 is. I know some of you are thinking 8 in your head, but it's 16. And then as we go through, we'll say 3 times 4, you'll get to 12. And we're going to continue to go up, and I want you to think about what 10 times 10 is. Say it out loud. What's 10 times 12? What's 15 times 13? Right now. Now, I know a lot of you didn't have it. And the reason you didn't is because you had to calculate it in your head. Because what you can do is you can repeato this. You can repeat because you've memorized your multiplication tables to a particular level. In the same way that I've told you about these fires, these different types of fires, but you might not understand what they look like. You might not understand how they work. When we think about Bloom's taxonomy, the first level is knowledge. Knowledge is about direct instruction where the teacher is giving you information. Teacher talks, students listen. And then the second one is you're going to do drill and practice. You might repeat something over and over again to help ingrain it within your mind. And so again, the teacher talks, the students listen, and they might repeat. But ultimately, it's a very basic sort of level. I call this type of learning teacher puke because all you're doing is regurgitating what the teacher said. The second level, and I want to start to move, is understanding. So I've actually put together 4 examples of the types of fire that I've talked about. So, is it okay if I move?
Yeah.
Okay, so as we start to think about it, when we start talking specifically about these types of fires, each of them has a different way, has a different purpose. The lean-to, you're going to have two logs that are a little higher, a log underneath, and I want you to understand why this works for wet weather. You're covering the wet weather, so the wet's going to hit on the top of the logs, but your fire still has a lot of air. Remember, air is essential, so you're going to put that under here. The fire is protected from the elements as it starts to burn underneath, and then it will give you a fire that you can make within wet weather. So this is for a wet weather piece. And now you have a better understanding of what that wood is like. Likewise, this one here is for campfires. This is if you want to sit around and you don't want to do a ton of work. For the most part, you're going to build a start fire. You might start with a pyramid, but then you're going to let these logs go on the side and they're going to slide into your fire. It's for a long evening of watching the fire that you don't have to keep throwing logs in all night long. You want to watch the logs slide in by themselves. They're angled in and they just slide into the middle. The one behind my chair is called a pyramid. The pyramid is intended to make a big bonfire. So underneath you have lots of air. This is for drier conditions. You're going to build your small kindling. You're going to use your dryer lint and you're going to put small pieces under there, and then this is going to start to build up. Your fire is going to be kind of a tower and go high. This is a bonfire sort of methodology. You're going to have a nice fire that looks beautiful. You can sit around it and enjoy it. The last one here in front, this is a tool that you're going to use if you want to cook. This is for cooking. It builds a lot of heat. You want marshmallows? You want a log cabin style. What you do with a log cabin is it's structured within these basic sort of elements, and then in the middle you build your small fire, and it starts to build up, and all of that, those coals fall down into it and give you a perfect heating spot in order to work on your fire. Okay, tools. Understanding is still often about teachers. Teachers are talking, I'm talking, you're listening. So there's that piece, but there's also a little bit more discussion. There's opportunities for you to ask questions, and there's lecture. And lecture is a very specific tool in that when we're thinking about lectures are when I talk and you take notes as a teacher. Or if you're the teacher, you talk and your students take notes. It's a small level within that educational piece. After that, when we're done, we move to this next level. This is where things get interesting for learning. This is all about application. Okay, if this were the real world and not COVID world, what we would do is I would have you, as students, build these fires. I wouldn't let you build fires in the classroom because that's dangerous. But what I would do is I'd have you start to stack these up to see how it works. I would want you to make mistakes. In fact, I would encourage you to try to figure out the wrong ways and what doesn't work with it. And I, as a teacher, would go along and I would kind of look at where you're at. Notice, you're working, I'm observing, I'm facilitating, things are changing. This is when you're going to start to get significantly more into your high leverage practices. These are the tools you're going to use there. You're going to elicit student thinking. If you're building a lean-to and then the logs are really spread out, I might ask you, so how do you think the fire is going to work within that lean-to? And you might have to think about it for a while and say, well, I guess it won't. So what do you need to do differently? And I want you to work on it and think about it. You're applying that new knowledge to that information. So do you remember when we did the zone of proximal development? You're using your scaffolding, right? You're using that previous knowledge with a new knowledge that's somewhat unstable, and then you're applying it to a specific idea. Next, after that, I want you to think about analysis. Analysis is breaking down the elements of why you're going to use something. It's that critical thinking process. So, for example, I've given you the different purposes of each of these. I might give you a set of conditions and ask you to figure out which fire we should use. So that's what we're going to do. So today...
TV.
TV?
TP.
TP. No. Here's why. I want you to think about this. It's been wet for several days. So all the wood is going to be somewhat wet. Now the purpose of this particular fire for me is I'm going to cook. So you're going to analyze what's going to happen. You know that I want to cook with the fire, and I want you to be able to cook within very rainy conditions. So you're going to have dry kindling, and you have to figure out which tool you're going to use. Now, in a little way, it's a trick question, because that next part is an evaluative process. Evaluation is when you look at something and you determine whether it was effective or not. So you've analyzed it, and you might decide you've got it narrowed down to 2. You might decide maybe the lean-to, maybe the log cabin. I'm not sure which one I want to go with, and you need to evaluate which would work. Evaluation is trying it. And you might go and say it's just too wet to use this particular methodology. And then you have to figure out what to do next. After evaluation is creativity. Once you understand and you've practiced and you've used these materials well enough, you know them ingrained, then you get to be creative. You don't just look at the log cabin, you think to yourself, how can I incorporate a lean-to with a log cabin because it's wet conditions? What part of the teepee should I use within here to make that happen? All of these are built on that creative process. Bloom's taxonomy. So if I were having you do this, the analysis process would be, I would give you a scenario and you would decide what tools you're going to use. I'm doing the facilitating, the questioning. I'm using mental modeling to help guide my students as you think about it. So how would you approach a fire if it was these conditions? I wonder what you might be able to do. The student is doing all the heavy lifting. Here's where Bloom's taxonomy gets really interesting. There's a learning cycle. And if you look at the PowerPoint, what you're going to see is that learning cycle is really an essential component to it. It begins with application. Now, I don't want to dismiss the importance of knowledge and understanding. You've got to have that foundation first, but that's all scaffolded. The next steps is application, analysis, evaluation, creativity, and that cycle begins again. You don't always hit creativity, but you always hit evaluation and then drive back to application. So you're going to try it, you analyze kind of what you need to do with it, and then you implement it, and then you evaluate whether it's successful, and then you go back to application and try something else to see if it works better or worse. That's the learning process. The student is doing the heavy lifting. The student is doing the intellectual engagement, and that is different than what we do now. I'm going to suggest most of your college career, almost all of it, you've spent in those first 2 levels. And I want you to think about your classes that you're taking now and the classes that you've had in the past. How often do you sit there while the teacher talks? If you're not doing something in the class intellectually with the material, if you're not doing an activity, if you're not doing something to play with new knowledge, you're living in knowledge and understanding. Students perceive knowledge and understanding as boring. They find application, analysis, and evaluation and creativity as engaging. You have to decide what type of teacher you want to be. You're going to use Bloom's taxonomy when you build your video, and that's going to help using those tools. I've given you some strategies on the side to give you some instructional strategies that you can play with as well, and you can try to use them, and it gives you what levels that you're at. When you do the video, I want you to tell me what level you're taking students to, what your intentional level is, the strategies you're using to get them there at each specific level. So if you're teaching how to build a fire, you're going to tell me what knowledge is, what it looks like if you're evaluating it, what it looks like if you're analyzing it, and go through that process. Okay, we're going to take a stop here just for a second because I want to change and shift gears a bit to part 2 of this conversation. Bloom's taxonomy, when you use that tool, especially when you engage it in activities, that's a progressive education model. That's about discovery learning, taking you out of doors, taking you even in the classroom and creating an out-of-desk situation for your students is all about progressive education. I imagine a 5th grade teacher, if you will, and this is my mind and how it works.
So the best way to do Bloom's taxonomy is to just basically do projects?
Always.
Project-based learning?
Project all the time. Project-based learning is the single most engaging project. Actually, I'm really happy you brought that up because one of the things I find really interesting is we often talk about the need for learning styles. Learning styles really isn't a thing. But what does happen is students have learning preferences. When you have project-based learning, that doesn't become an issue. because students are already engaged. They're going to use the methodology and the modality of learning that they need to figure out what they have to do next, right? So for example, if I'm telling you that we're going to study rivers, and I want you to figure out what's wrong with this river because it stinks, and we need to know if it's a good stink or a bad stink, we're going to come up with all kinds of ways. So we might stand in a class of 5th graders with our fedoras and our jackets like Indiana Jones doing our exploration. And we're going to go out to a river and we're going to sit down as our progressive education and say, this river could be polluted, it could be dangerous, or it might not. Does anybody have ideas of how we can figure that out? And Grayson might, for example, say, I have an idea. Let's throw Gavin in the river and see if he dies. If he dies, it was definitely polluted. If he gets sick. And I might say, well, he's my favorite child, so I really don't want to do that. Let's throw Grayson in. And Grayson, of course, is going to argue with that, but then we'll have more rational minds, and Rebecca will walk into the room and say, or well, it's not a room, it's outside, so you know what I mean. So we're standing by the river. She might say, well, why don't we just do some chemical testing to determine what's in it? So we'll do a fecal coliform count. But we don't know how to do that. Progressive education asks questions, and it helps you think about inquiry. It helps you think about the questions that you have to ask, and then from that question, you have to figure out what you got to know. If you don't know what you know, you got to go figure it out. So if I don't know how to determine whether a river is healthy or not, that's where I start. If I already know what makes a healthy river, I need to figure out how to test it. If I know how to test it, and I already know what's in the river, I might need to figure out how to fix it. Progressive education's asking a pertinent question, using a methodology of exploration and discovery in order to understand how to best accomplish the task. Someplace along the line, usually 2nd, 3rd, or 4th grade, and I'm going to ask you, Gray, to think about when it was for you, we decided education had to be boring, that students had to sit in a chair and be bored. And it's such a mythology. How old were you when you started thinking education was boring, that school's boring?
Like 6th, 7th grade, probably.
Okay.
Just started, nothing was happening, ever.
You just sit there.
Yeah. Actually, freshman year of high school, we stopped going on field trips, like, ever. Like, we used to have one every once in a while in middle school, elementary. But then, as soon as freshman year of high school hit, we just didn't do anything.
And you
We
sat?
just sat sitting in school.
Taking notes.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like sometimes that when you're in classroom, that actually the classroom is useless because ultimately you could go home and read the book and get the same thing?
Yes.
If your students feel like that, or you feel like that, the classroom isn't engaging. You're not using Bloom's. You're not using good teaching strategies. You're using old school stuff from that apprenticeship of observation, and it's ineffective. Change how you think about it. Don't do what was done because it was what was done. Analyze it and determine what you should be doing. And that'll change your teaching strategies. By the way, if you worry about classroom management, good pedagogy diminishes your need for classroom management because students are too busy having fun and engaged in the work to think about messing around. And it doesn't matter where you're at. It's always the same. Students engaged don't have problems. They just don't. Or you have significantly fewer. You're always going to have someone you have to deal with, but if your goal is the content, then you're not worrying about the discipline. And that's really essential for it. So I hope this was helpful. This is going to be one of our last videos based on these pedagogical sort of components. And enjoy. I hope your videos go well.
Good.